This is the UK productivity problem breakout session. Compared to its peers, the UK's productivity shows signs of ill health, a problem that has widened even further in the past 10 years and is very at the forefront of our minds at present. What explains this gap and what role do standards play? So our speakers this morning, firstly, we will hear from Richard Keller, Professor of Economics at the University of Nottingham. Research main interests, the cause and consequences of technological change and the effects on productivity at a firm level and on international trade. Richard has carried out research for the government and the Department for International Trade, OECD, and the European Commission. Following Richard will be Associate Professor Cher Lee, an economist by training. Cher has consulted widely across government offices, international organizations, and private businesses. Most recently, Cher has worked on a 2 million ESRC productivity hub project around productivity and what works. Cher is also our first recipient of the BSI Education About Standardization Award previous year. With that, I will hand over to our speakers, and please do enjoy the first session.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so the plan for this session is to talk about a project that's going to explore this question about the relationship between standards and the UK's productivity problem. And from the sort of academic side, we think we know some of the ways that standards might have an impact here, and I'll talk about that literature, me from the productivity side, and then Cher from the standards side. And the broader context here is a research collaboration that's taking place between the University of Nottingham and BSI, and to give some names to that, so that would be myself and Cher from the University of Nottingham, then Matthew Charles, Ben Sheridan, and Ivan Salcedo from BSI. And during this session, we're really interested. We don't have the answer here. There is no robust evidence on the link between standards and productivity. And so we're interested, we started this project, and we're interested in as to your insights as to the connections here. So to give a broader, a sense of the broader project that this particular collaboration fits under, it's actually a project labelled Propel, which is funded by a government agency called the ESRC, and it will be funded for 3 years, and it started just in January this year. It's a collaboration between a number of different universities, being led by Strathclyde, but including Nottingham, and it has got a number of partners within that, including BSI. And the focus of this Propel hub is to focus on knowledge exchange. So it's bringing together agencies, academic and non-academic, to share knowledge and ideas about the way that the UK's productivity problem might be solved. And it's trying to do this it's not just about learning from each other and sharing that knowledge. It's trying to be proactive in that, and it's interested in trying to find out what works. And so we're going to be looking to apply a set of methodologies which will allow us to understand whether, the causal relationships between various determinants of productivity. Okay, so from the productivity side, what are the issues, and what are and what are the ways that standards might help in dealing with that? The UK's got a number of productivity problems, and I've tried to just pick out a couple of them here. And so the first one would be that, as Sahara's already mentioned, the UK has productivity that's lower than its major competitors. And so on this chart here, it's got data for the UK and measured against France and Germany. And you can see that this isn't just a recent problem. This is a problem that has been apparent for actually a long time, but it's a gap that's appeared to have widened over time. A second productivity problem that the UK has is the regional differences that exist in productivity. In fact, those regional differences are at the widest compared to all European countries. And that's shown on this chart here, where you can see that the productivity in regions such as London, strong emphasis on financial services and business services, but also Aberdeen, so specialism in oil, is so much higher than the bulk of the rest of the UK. So they have productivity somewhere between 85 and 95%. So the majority of the UK has a productivity gap relative to the rest of the UK. So a useful way of trying to think about how you might go about solving those problems is to recognize the role of businesses and industries in determining productivity. And I've tried to show that on this slide here. So what this slide shows is that within a particular industry, there exists a large number of firms, and some of those firms are UK owned and some of them may be foreign owned businesses, and also that those businesses differ in their size. So some are small and some are relatively big. And so the way that you measure aggregate productivity is to begin by measuring the productivity of those individual businesses and then adding them up. But you'd want to give more weight to the firms, the businesses which are bigger relative to those which are smaller. And so, and then you do that for each of the industries in the UK. So this begins to give us perhaps three potential explanations for why the UK might have lower productivity. So it might be something to do with the industries that we have, and we often hear talk about the industries that we have relative to other countries, and equally the industries that we've lost over time. And then you can also see that what matters is the productivity of those individual firms. So how productive are those firms, but also the relationship between size and productivity. So is it the case that our productive firms are the big ones, or are our productive firms too small? Or to put that another way, are some of our very large firms unproductive? And so we might separate this into sort of two broad classes of explanation. So is it something to do with the industrial mix, or is it something to do with what's happening within industries? And what I'm going to do is focus on really the first two of those explanations. So is it something to do with industries, or is it something to do with the productivity of our individual firms? So beginning with, explanations about the wrong sectors. So there's a couple of one chart and one figure on this slide, and you can see, if you look here at this measure of productivity, so this is productivity per employee, so gross value added per employee, and you can see that there are differences in in that productivity across these different sectors. So it's much higher in manufacturing compared to agriculture, and it's higher still in some of these business service sectors. But also that, you know, the size of these, the relative size of these sectors also differs as well. And so the sectoral composition can be important. As we've already saw, London and Aberdeen stood out as having very high productivity, and we know that they have specialisms in high productivity sectors, business services and oil. And if we thought a bit of it from a cross-country perspective, then we can also help to explain the rapid growth that we've seen in countries such as China, where we've seen, you know, quite marked movement from people out of agriculture, low productivity sectors such as agriculture, and into higher productivity sectors such as manufacturing. But it's certainly not the case that this issue about the sectors is all of the story. So on this bottom chart here, we've got three different lines. So we've got the blue line measures the overall productivity growth within the UK. The red line measures whether it's something to do with the sectors we have and whether we're losing or gaining productive sectors or not. And then the green line is what's happening within industry. So are firms becoming more productive, but also are those productive firms becoming bigger? And this is done from 1950 up to 2007. And you can see that almost all of the explanation for aggregate productivity growth in the UK is actually coming from productivity change within sectors, and very little of that is coming from structural change. So, for example, we hear lots of talk about how the UK has lost manufacturing sectors over the last 30, 40 years or so, and that's been a drag on its productivity. And you can see that that's true, but that tends to be a very small effect because these things take such a long time to appear. Or you might think of it of changing the sectoral composition of a particular region as a way of improving productivity. We looked at that for the region in which Nottingham is based in, so the region of Nottingham and Derby. And there you found that, so that region has a productivity of about 90% of the UK average, but it tends to have more manufacturing compared to the average and rather less business services. And so if you shift that region to look more like London, for example, because you take away high productivity manufacturing and replace it with high productivity business services, it tends not to move the overall productivity gap by very much. So it would only close that productivity gap by a couple of percent or so. So when we're thinking about the potential impact of standards on productivity, whilst they have standards have a strong connection with technologies and therefore industries, this doesn't appear to be a likely place that it's going to have its strongest effects. That second explanation was that somehow the firms or businesses within the UK are less productive. And it's true that the productivity differences between businesses are very big. And that's shown on this chart here. So we've got two lines on here. One of these is the green line, which is the UK, and the dotted line, which is Nottingham and Derby region. And so firms up here are high productivity firms, and firms down here are low productivity firms. And you can think of this axis here as just being the number of firms. So you can see that there are relatively few exceptional firms in the UK, and equally there's relatively few really bad or low productivity firms in the UK, and the bulk of firms are somewhere in the middle here. And just to give you a sense of perspective, the firms up here are producing about 5 or 6 times more productive than the firms that are down here. And we see these same patterns no matter the industry that we look in, and no matter the country that we look at. The dotted line is, say, the one region within the UK, and you can begin to understand where that productivity gap for this region exists. So it has slightly too few of these really successful firms, and very slightly too many of these low productivity firms, and but it's really the bulk of firms in the middle here. It has too many firms which are just a bit less than the average productivity in the UK. And if you're thinking about really trying to influence aggregate productivity, it's actually this group of firms here that you might wish to concentrate on. So this chart very much emphasizes that, you know, firms are very different, and so they have different characteristics. And so we might start to look at their characteristics and give them labels, and these labels come from the OECD. And so firms with really high productivity typically are typically multinational firms, and they're typically R&D intensive firms, and they have strong management, and they're very skill intensive. And I don't want to give you the suggestion that being multinational or being R&D intensive is the cause of why they're more productive, because being a multinational and being R&D intensive is also very costly. So it's only the most productive firms which can afford those costs. So those are the superstars. We might think of a set of firms above the average. These firms who are involved in international trade. They're more likely to be technology adopters rather than creators of new technology. They've got good management, but not outstanding. And then if we thought about the weakest firms, you know, they're much more likely to serve the domestic market. They're, you know, have their weaker technology. They're more likely to be later adopters of technology. And so thinking about these firms in this way and their different characteristics, we can start to recognize that the policy levers and the role of standards may act differently on different firms. So, for example, if we thought about policy levers which focused on the creation of new technologies, then we're talking about those impacts on those superstar firms. Whereas if we're talking about changes on the adoption of new technologies, then we're talking, you know, the laggards and the national champions. Or if we're talking about management practices and organizations, is that about getting the national champions up to the superstar standards, or is it about getting the laggards up towards even just the average? And then what also matters is, whether it's the productive firms which are growing or not. So often business support programs within the UK focus on the growth of firms, but they don't think about whether it's the productive firms or unproductive firms which you're getting to grow. And there's some evidence actually that they're better at picking and growing the unproductive firms at cost to the productive firms. And it's about access to finance. So how can they grow? But also its relationship with entrepreneurship as well. So the entry of better firms, these firms are typically small, but if they're productive, they'll survive and they grow. And then thinking about ways that, for example, the Treasury plan of productivity maps onto that. And you can see that it's about impacting on different parts of this story. So innovation is about superstar firms. On business support and access to finance is about allowing those productive firms to grow. I should say the Treasury has 5 strategic priorities here. I've missed one off, which is housing, and partly because it's less obvious of the way that connects to this broader story. Okay, so now I'll hand over to Cher, who'll talk about the relationship between standards and businesses.
Okay, thanks, Richard. So like Richard said, even though our Propel Hub is relatively new, as economists and researchers in this area, we have been researching and analyzing data on the drivers of productivity for the past decades or even longer. And here we especially see standards as a crucial component of our modern economic infrastructure. There are various ways technical standards especially can influence business performance throughout the life cycle of a product or its underlying technology, from the new product development to the subsequent building the market and to achieve the growth. And here, I just want to particularly comment on 2 critical stages of this life cycle where standards play a very prominent role. And the first one is this commercialization stage, as you can see here, or the so-called valley of death, which is a metaphor to show the tremendous amount of risks involved for a firm to bring its basic research and science to the successful commercialization of the product. So sort of cross this chasm from research to the market. And here, that's inherently because of the modern technologies, which are very complex systems. So converting these basic ideas to the new products involves a huge amount of these risks, which can come from the complexity of technology itself, as well as the uncertainty surrounding the market demand of their new product. And so in this way, we would say technical standards can encompass the industry's technological base and this so-called infra technology. So the infrastructure technology that's embodied in standards can help bridge the gap between the basic research and the markets. I'll come back to the second role in terms of the standards supporting productivity and growth a little bit later when I talk about productivity. But before that, let me show you some evidence here in terms of the risk reduction associated with standardization, and that's based on our recent research project. So, and here, what is the implication for risk management of standardization? And I can see that we have some first evidence using large-scale data from companies who participate in developing ICT standards, which are coordinated by nearly 200 SDOs, these standards development organizations, and that includes industry consortia as well around the globe, such as some of the well-known ones like IEEE, 3GPP, IETF, WaitMax, etc., etc. That's about 200 SDOs. So that's pretty much covering the whole universe of ICT standardization. And here we look at a simple question: so whether those firms involved in developing technology standards have lower risks compared with those firms, and especially in those equally large and R&D intensive firms who don't actually participate in SDOs. And so here we measure risks in the eyes of the investors. And so there are 2 measures we look at: the value and risk, which is about the worst case scenario in the stock market. So what is the maximum loss expected in their securities? And also look at the volatility. So vanilla risk measure is on the left, and the volatility measure is on the right. And the volatility is about these big swings of securities prices. And you can see that the pictures are broadly comparable. And here I should say that the data is based on a sample of the top 2,000 global firms in terms of the R&D expenditure. So I won't bore you with the technical details, but what we found was that controlling for the other firm level characteristics, so you're looking at firms across the employment band and controlling for their turnover and controlling for their technological assets such as their patents, etc. And we do find that the companies that participate in developing ICT standards as members of these SDOs tend to have substantially lower risks. Okay, and that risk reduction is more significant for those who have higher levels of business risk, so the kind of higher risk group. Well, you might think that could it just be the correlation in the sense that those who are better managed, or especially those with better risk management practices or higher managerial quality, might be more likely to participate in developing standards, or it's just a resource issue, but it's not actually standardization process itself that's driving the risk reduction. So in other words, which way does that causality go? Or is there any additionality of this participation? So we then did further checks, and we could actually verify that developing standards which are coordinated by these large global SDOs indeed has a causal effect on lowering business risk. And we can talk about these details if anyone is interested in that. So moving on to the role of standards in terms of boosting productivity. And here, a lot of you might have been familiar with the research by various NSBs, such as ISO and BSI's work, which has documented standards as a major contributor to economic growth of the UK and the world economy. And we know that the standards and both product standards and compatibility standards especially have played an important part in the various generations of our industrial revolution. And in terms of the third one that we are currently going through, we know that standards became a critical part of our high-tech industry's infrastructure in this digital revolution, which is very much driven by our ICT technologies and based on the advent of computers. And looking forward, we know BSI and many SDOs are already heavily involved in developing standards that govern the emerging technologies underpinning our fourth industrial revolution. And what is beyond debate is that this is definitely a new era that requires a much more technical infrastructure than ever before, including thousands of standards that might vary in their contents and in their structure, in order to support businesses throughout that life cycle of technologies there. At a higher level, standards can enable many different functions to ensure the components of a technology system can be effectively produced and integrated. If you look at the range of functions the standards enable, and it's perhaps not surprising that there is a massive implication for business productivity. So that function ranges from equipment calibrations, the categorization of their materials, and from setting data formats to enabling the consummation of the market transactions. And we can also look at this role from both the supply side and demand side of our economy. And on the supply side, we've seen a high level of modularity in our technology systems, which are largely enabled by standards. So that modularity has really propelled the corporate trends of specialization and decentralization. And the end result is what we see now, a very global network of production, which are characterized by these massively complex supply chains, especially in the high-tech supply chains, as we have witnessed in recent global crisis. The innovation and production have become a lot more distributed among materials and their component suppliers, as well as the integrators of their products and service systems. I think it's also through the standards infrastructure, the cost for market transactions can be substantially reduced between our suppliers and end users. And on the demand side here, and so from the adoption point of view, technology standards can also help level the playing field for businesses, and they enable compatibility. As we already know, they can open up new market opportunities and then to help scale up these new markets, which build on these infra technologies there. So in that sense, companies can enjoy better economies of scale and their economy of scope, as well as achieving higher efficiency. So coming back to this productivity policy that Richard mentioned earlier, we can see a prominent role of standards in all these channels of firms becoming productive, really. So technology adoption, so improving the management practices and building a more efficient infrastructure. And so to achieve this vision of that innovation-led growth, what we really need is that enhanced public-private investment plan in supporting our technological infrastructure in order to accelerate that effective and timely diffusion of our infra technologies there. So currently, productivity may feel like a second-order problem where we're in the middle of this crisis. I think we would do our best to save lives. It is never too early to really start plan to restore livelihoods. So the most substantial impact of the pandemic may well lie outside of our public health realm or our science systems. But as we can see that there is a really strong impact on the economy that's emerging. And a lot of you might have seen the recent news and various types of forecasts being circulated on social media, etc. So there is the alphabet of different shapes of that recoveries that our economy might take. I won't go into details of these and different shapes there. As you can see, there's a V-shaped, there's U-shaped, or the W-shaped, double deep type of recovery, or there's perhaps more pessimistic L-shaped recovery. Some realistic scenario might be more the U-shaped, in the sense that the recovery might take more than a couple of quarters, and because the economies that have suffered a faster and deeper contraction than in our previous financial crisis, and this might be actually in the likely scenario. Another one is this last one here, the so-called swoosh, or this kind of tip type of recovery, which starts with a very sharp downturn, and then you have a gradual recovery as lockdowns are eased more gently than they were imposed. Then we can expect to see a much softer rebound there. So you can decide which one you believe. I think it very largely depends on the scenarios and assumptions being made, and which sectors we're looking at, the geographies and different pace there as well. So here, I probably want to finish my last slide on a more forward-looking note, to quote Albert Einstein, "In the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity." I will hear a little bit more about BSI's planned recession in the afternoon on organizational resilience, which I think is a very important issue here. But just to offer some economic perspectives here, and also potential implications of businesses who are looking to bounce back from this. I think it's quite tempting to look for things to get back to our normal life after tremendous disruption, but business should really stick to their original mission, if not the original plan. And we need to think about how we can deliver those missions in such changed circumstances. And here it's, in terms of the resources side, we can see that this may be actually a really quite good opportunity to take a break and think about how we can best reallocate the resources to their more productive use. This may be an unprecedented crisis, but also it is the cheapest time to invest for the long term, since the opportunity cost of our capital and the other resources are really low. And productivity will bounce back after the crisis, and businesses who can make the most out of the current emerging opportunities, I think will go on to be very successful. There is also consideration on the intertemporal substitution as well. So in many sectors, our productivity and output are almost nil. But when the recovery comes and when we go back to work, we'll see a surge in business activities. And how do we recoup this lost output? How do we do this at pace and as much as possible? I think these are important questions to really plan right now. And how do we adjust our work patterns to prepare for these substitution over time? It's very difficult, I think, to forecast the long-term impact of this crisis on productivity and growth. But as many of us are already discussing, it's perhaps one of the best natural experiments here that we can have on various step changes our technology can bring, really, on the adoption of ICT. And it has been a quite formidable catalyst of ICT adoption. And it's about also rethinking our management practices, our future work, and what are the new enablers of productivity as well. I think there are various trends and we're already experiencing, but right now we have definitely seen these being very much accelerated during the middle of this pandemic. On the ICT front, I think the technology has always been there, right? So what we really prevented this wider and quick adoption of our new online collaborative practices was not really a lack of these super technologies, but rather a lot of those was to do with our inertia of these mindset or practices. And there was a widespread belief that many of our human interactions are perhaps better performed when people are actually in the same room and they're together and the same meeting, etc. However, what we have seen right now is that around this adoption of new practices is that this is perhaps likely to dramatically change the future of ICTs as the technologies that can support a long distance and complex interaction. And a lot of us are still amazed at how the UK's whole higher education sector and all the universities have all moved online over a couple of weeks' time. On the management practices side, again, work from home. So that's perceived to actually have a lot of benefits, really. And then it means that we are now less susceptible to various types of inefficiencies and disruptions or systemic failures in our transport infrastructure. If you think about some of the drivers and then people have looked at in terms of considering differential between the UK and the French productivity, that is that in France, there are much more modern transport infrastructure and bare roads, which has a huge impact on their higher level of productivity. And so here, just to cite a recent study by a group of researchers based at Stanford University, and this Bloom et al. 2015, and they did this experiment and one of China's largest travel agency, which was Nasdaq listed. What they found was that throughout 9 months of work from home, compared with the control group of the people who were not given the opportunity to work from home, there was actually some 20 to 30% of the productivity increase following the introduction of these type of practice. So in a nutshell, I think business that can leverage these, that's my alarm going off, so I probably should stop soon. Businesses that can leverage this transformative force will go on to become very successful and will be the productivity winners for the future. So very lastly, just want to summarize, the future perhaps is not what it used to be. And I want to encourage you to connect with our Prepare Hub to think about what is the next normal. And in the short run, I think the most talked about question is how to return to work safely. But going forward, we would very much want to have some feedback and in hearing your understanding of what is the role of standards in managing the productivity bounce back, and how we can perhaps get ahead of this coronavirus crisis. And it is a really good time here, at the very outset of our Prepare Hub. It's really a time for your maximum impact in terms of shaping our research agenda going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Richard. That was really interesting, and lots of very useful information there. For the attendees, the slides are and the video recording of this session is available. So do feel free to go back. We have a few minutes. I'm conscious that there's some Q&As, questions and answers, so we can go through to them. But I was just wondering if anyone wants to. I'm just conscious that our Director of Standards, Scott Steedman, has raised his hand and wants to give some comments. So I can put him through, and then we can go into the Q&A session.
Well, good morning, everybody. That's thank you, Sahar. Thank you, and thank you, Richard and Cher. That was really interesting. I sat here absolutely riveted by your very thorough exposition there. Thank you. This is such an important part of BSI's activity to really get to the heart of the value of standards in companies and in productivity, and I think there's a huge opportunity. The question I have just posted is really to ask that so many econometric studies in the past have focused what I would consider narrowly on the issues of technical specifications, standards for production, all that kind of thing, where you say, well, if you control that particular standard, then I can stop other people joining the market, and if I all that sort of thing. Actually, I don't think that's the issue at all. I think the real opportunity now, because we've moved now onto one standard used everywhere, so international standards for manufacturing are global standards, so it's already there. You're either using it or not. The real opportunity for productivity is surely in the organization of the labor force, of the way companies are governed and managed and led. For example, a company that's a safer company, has fewer accidents, will be more productive. I mean, there are fewer people off work, the insurance premiums are less, it's a no-brainer. Companies that have proper management systems in place will be, in my own personal experience, 20% more efficient. That's like 20% less labor. So they have to be more productive. Do you have in this analysis a whole consideration around the value of standards on the softer side of corporate activity, leadership, governance, occupational health and safety, what's called quality management, risk management, all of those softer benefits that really add up to a very big productivity win from the same labor force? Thank you.
Should I say quickly, just to have a quick comment on that? That's exactly true, and I couldn't agree more on Scott there. So there has been actually quite a literature also looking at the efficiency gains, and that's enabled by standards such as perhaps some of the very popular ones like ISO 9001, and like you said, the quality management side and the suite of the other management standards. But I think the key caveats from these studies, and you alluded to, is this perhaps lack of ability to establish the causality, that a lot of these are correlations we observe. A lot of larger firms and the firms that are more R&D intensive are investing this or that, but you don't actually quite know what is additionality of this. So what we really need, which is on very top of the agenda of our productivity hub, is the ability to conduct these interventions to actually show the firms and by using very rigorous methodologies to be able to actually say, look, if you use the standards, there is a net gain of this or that. And so that's a very important issue on the intervention side. Yeah.
Can you still hear me? I was at a conference, on an insurance conference, and they put up a slide on the screen, and the presenter just talked calmly through the reduction in insurance premium by sector, which varied between 30 and 70% for companies that were using an occupational health and safety standard. And I said, oh, well, what's all that about? And he said, oh, well, they're safer companies. So their premiums are far less. They have less people off work, less people injured, less people hurt. And in my own experience, when I was running an engineering company some years ago, I was asked as a junior director to bring in the management system. We did that. And we suddenly lost all that rework, mistakes, errors, because we were much more organized. And we definitely saw a 20% uplift in our ability to deliver with the same, in terms of hours of work to produce reports. We just saw that. It was overnight. So I think that and it was a step change. So I think that it is interesting to explore how we can demonstrate the causality, because I have no doubt it's there. It's just about finding the model and proving it. Thank you.
Can I just chip in and maybe a brief comment on that? I mean that's I think very much our view on this as well is that we're viewing standards as kind of embodying best practice and showing firms what best practice is, and it's really about thinking about recognizing that there are differences in the abilities of firms, and it's about showing those firms that are national champions or laggard firms, the lower productivity firms, what best practice is, and what are the ways that they should go about actually trying to improve themselves, and standards we think of as one route that they might it might start to make them make.
I think that's quite right, Richard. Another example that just immediately springs to mind is recruitment. So recruitment and retention, it's a huge problem. If you have a churn of 5%, 10%, or 20% of your workforce, the costs of going through that from the company perspective are massive. So here again, if there are good practices that we can bottle and share with companies, SMEs, big companies, doesn't matter, laggards, leaders, then to me automatically there's a causal link between seeing those costs of employment and training and personal development and retention cut and productivity increased.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much. So I know that we're running a little bit over time, but I can see that everyone's participants and attendees are all here, so we can carry on answering a few more questions, but I just wanted to let you know that there is a plenary going on as well. But please do stay with us if you're still interested in answering some of our questions. There's some really interesting ones. I think one of the ones I will just sort of flag up is, what is the timescale for future research, and what is your sort of your plan going forward?
Wow, that's a really good question. So there has been, we have started our work and with, for instance, BSI, and so that as to take that standards research agenda forward. Like I said, we are really primarily interested in not just produce another piece of research which is based on their analysis, but we really want to find out what works and be able to diffuse this knowledge through our knowledge exchange activities by talking to businesses and the policy departments that can actually make these happen. So the important area is for us to explore right now what are some of these standards-based interventions that we can use to run our experiments, if you like, to perhaps, and Richard mentioned this randomized control trial, and we do this on a trial basis. So we have a nice comparable group of control firms and the firms that receive these particular standards. But our focus here is really on the two key drivers of the activity in terms of the adoption of digital technologies and how to improve the management practices. Does Richard want to say a bit more?
Yeah, just in terms of picking up on the timeline there. So, the project we're involved in will last for 3 years, starting from January, and I should perhaps add to that productivity has really risen up the policy agenda in the last few years, and we know of sort of various funding streams which will come online, which will hopefully allow us to continue this collaboration on beyond that 3 years. That said, it's somewhat unfortunate that our project's very much about exchanging knowledge and therefore getting people together, and we've decided to time that in a period of time where bringing people together is clearly quite difficult. So, so some of that activity, I think, will end up being pushed slightly back towards, well, we'll see where we are in the autumn and the start of next year, rather than the start of this year. But it will certainly be over the next couple of 2-3 years.
We just follow BSI's suit to do virtual. Yes, and
yeah, it seems to be working really, really well. But please do attendees raise your hand if there's any topics. Another interesting one, which I think is an interesting question for sort of working parents at the moment, is really, are standards similar to the way a good parent brings up children? When the boundaries are clear, they can get things done much better. Is that a reasonable assessment at this point? That it's the boundaries and the good practice that really helps shape all the other activities that happen around an organization, really?
Yeah, I think so. I think, people manage on this multitask perhaps in different ways. I have to say, I'm perhaps not very successful in this dimension in terms of doing homeschooling while enabling productivity, efficiency at the same time. But I think what is beyond doubt is this learning effect as well going forward, which has been picked up by this study which looks at the work from home practices in China. That is that, after a 1 year intensive kind of experiment type of setting, then these workers who have been given the opportunity to work from home 4 days out of 5 per week have also learned how to do it better. So when they self-select into the next wave of these kind of experiments, and they enjoy the even higher productivity gain. So I think, we definitely can't underestimate the effect of people learn, and they tend to do better by learning by doing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think people are now dropping off slowly. I think we have had some really good comments. We will keep the questions. If you have interest of the panel members, please do get in touch with us. And the panel members, you did share your contact details for any further questions.
Happy to share the slides pack as well, so there will be our
content. That would be absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for participating. Thank you for a really interesting panel session, and great that the technology all worked.
I can see that now we've got a list of comments and feedback. There are some of these that are really, really good and very thought-provoking. It's a pity that we don't get enough time to get back to these during the session, but we'll follow it up. If there's a window of keeping our discussion board here, we'll write back to you and to invite you to get involved with our hub's work.
That is absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for your support and being so accommodating. Thank you for your time. And thank you everyone who attended. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.